When Keanu Reeves adopted a scarred and trembling German shepherd from a shelter, he thought he was giving the dog a second chance. What he didn't know was that someone was watching, someone who wanted the dog back. What started as an act of kindness would soon unravel a dangerous mystery, proving that some pasts refused to stay buried. Keanu Reeves had seen his fair share of broken souls, both on and off the screen. But when he walked into the shelter that day, he wasn't expecting to meet one in the form of a trembling German shepherd with hollow eyes and scars that told a story darker than words ever could. The staff called him Ghost, though he barely existed, just a shadow curled in the back of his kennel, too afraid to move, too defeated to hope. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't even flinch when people passed by. It was as if he had already accepted that no one would ever come for him. Keanu crouched outside the kennel, watching the dog for a long moment. Something in Ghost's eyes pulled at him, a silent plea buried beneath layers of fear and pain. "He's a lost cause," one of the shelter workers muttered, arms crossed. "Doesn't eat, doesn't respond. Most people don't even notice he's here." Keanu wasn't most people. "I'll take him," he said without hesitation. The worker's brows shot up. "You sure? He's complicated. We don't know much about where he came from, but the way he reacts to sudden movements, loud noises, it's like he's seen war." Keanu's gaze never left Ghost. "I know the feeling." The paperwork was a formality. A few signatures, a quick rundown of care instructions that mostly boiled down to be patient. And suddenly, Ghost was his responsibility. But as Keanu led the silent, hesitant dog to his car, something made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A black SUV was parked across the street, engine running. He caught a glimpse of a man inside, face obscured by sunglasses, watching them. The moment Keanu turned his head, the SUV pulled away. Keanu didn't know why, but a thought settled uncomfortably in his mind. Ghost wasn't just abandoned. Someone had left him here for a reason. The drive home was quiet. Ghost sat stiffly in the back seat, pressed against the farthest corner like he was trying to make himself disappear. He didn't whimper, didn't move, just stared blankly at the passing world outside, as if none of it mattered. Keanu kept one hand steady on the wheel, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror. The streets of Los Angeles blurred past, but his mind kept drifting back to that black SUV. Coincidence? Maybe. But in his experience, there was no such thing. When they finally pulled into his driveway, Ghost hesitated before stepping out of the car. Keanu gave him space, not pulling on the leash, not coaxing, just waiting. After a long pause, Ghost moved. One careful step, then another. Keanu's home was nothing extravagant, despite what the tabloids would have people believe. A minimalist, quiet space tucked away from the chaos of Hollywood. No flashing lights, no crowds, just stillness. Ghost stopped at the entrance, frozen. His eyes darted left, then right. It was subtle, but Keanu recognized it instantly. He's checking for exits. Inside, Ghost remained on edge. He didn't explore, didn't sniff around like most dogs would in a new environment. Instead, he found the darkest corner of the living room and curled into himself. Keanu didn't push. He simply sat down on the floor, a few feet away, pulling a book from the coffee table. Minutes passed, then an hour. Keanu didn't speak, didn't move closer. Trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long golden streaks across the floor. Ghost lifted his head slightly, just enough to glance at Keanu before dropping it again. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Before I continue this incredible journey, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever felt that unspoken connection with an animal, the kind that goes beyond words, hit that like button. Because what happens next might just restore your faith in second chances." That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Keanu woke to a sound he hadn't heard before. A low, sharp whimper. "Ghost." Keanu sat up, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The dog was still in the corner, but his body was rigid, his paws twitching. A nightmare. Keanu had seen this before, Not with dogs, but with people. Soldiers. Survivors. He moved carefully, slow enough that the wooden floor didn't creak. Kneeling at a distance, he spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "Hey, buddy. You're safe. No one's gonna hurt you." Ghost jolted awake, eyes wide and unfocused. His breathing was sharp, erratic. Then, without warning, he lunged. Keanu barely had time to react before Ghost's teeth snapped inches from his hand. A raw, desperate attack, not out of aggression but terror. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't pull back. He simply held his ground, steady and unmoving. For several tense seconds, Ghost just stood there, panting heavily, his body trembling with fear. Then, slowly, the panic faded from his eyes. He backed away, lowering his head, ashamed of something that wasn't his fault. Keanu exhaled. "It's okay," he murmured. "I get it." Because the truth was, he did. Ghost wasn't fighting him. He was fighting the past. And Keanu knew that battle all too well. The next morning, Keanu woke to an unexpected sight. Ghost was still in the corner, but he was watching him. Not just the occasional wary glance from the night before, but truly watching. His ears weren't pinned back in fear. His posture wasn't as tense. It was subtle, but Keanu had spent enough time around wounded souls to recognize progress when he saw it. He moved slowly as he stood up, careful not to startle the dog. Ghost tracked his movements but didn't recoil. Another step forward. Keanu brewed his morning coffee in silence, keeping his routine as normal as possible. The last thing Ghost needed was pressure. Instead, he let the quiet work its way into the space between them, allowing the dog to observe and decide for himself whether this was a place he could trust. By the time Keanu sat down with his coffee, he noticed something different. Ghost's head was no longer tucked between his paws. He was still curled in his corner, but his gaze was locked onto Keanu's every move. Not with fear, with curiosity. That was enough for now. The hours passed, and the quiet rhythm of the house continued. Ghost didn't move from his spot, but he was alert, taking in every detail. The way Keanu moved without sudden motions. The way he spoke softly when he had to. The way he never looked directly at him for too long, understanding that eye contact could still be a challenge. It wasn't until later that day that the next breakthrough happened. Keanu stood by the kitchen counter, casually peeling apart a piece of grilled chicken from his lunch. Without thinking, he tore off a small bite-sized piece and placed it on the floor, a few feet away from Ghost. Then he stepped back, making no effort to coax or encourage. Minutes passed, then more. At first, Ghost didn't move, only flicking his ears at the scent. But then, hesitantly, cautiously, he shifted his front paw. Just an inch, then another. Keanu didn't react, didn't speak. He barely breathed. Ghost inched forward, slow and deliberate, his body still trembling from years of ingrained fear. When he reached the small piece of chicken, he paused. He looked at Keanu. A test. Keanu stayed still. Ghost lowered his head and, in one swift motion, took the food. But instead of retreating to his corner as expected, he hesitated. He lingered. His dark eyes flickered toward Keanu's hand, still resting on the floor, relaxed and open. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so lightly that Keanu almost didn't feel it, Ghost's cold nose brushed against his fingers. It lasted less than a second, a fleeting whisper of contact before the dog pulled back, retreating into his space. But Keanu didn't need more than that, because for the first time Ghost had chosen to bridge the gap. That night, Keanu slept with the quiet knowledge that something had shifted. The walls weren't down, but there was a crack in them now, a sliver of light breaking through. But as he drifted into sleep, the feeling of unease returned. He thought of the black SUV, the stranger outside the vet clinic, the way Ghost flinched at certain sounds. Sounds that weren't random but specific. This wasn't just a case of neglect. This dog had been running from something, and Keanu was starting to realize that whatever Ghost had escaped from wasn't finished looking for him. The following days unfolded in careful increments, each small victory feeling more significant than the last. Ghost still kept his distance, But he no longer cowered in the shadows. He watched Keanu from across the room, his sharp eyes tracking his every movement. Not with fear, but with something new, something almost like recognition. Keanu never rushed him. He let Ghost dictate the pace. Food was left near him, never forced. Doors remained open, giving him the choice to come and go as he pleased. Slowly, Ghost began to test the space around him, stepping further from his self-imposed exile. A few cautious steps into the living room. A lingering moment near the window. It wasn't much, but it was change. But progress, especially when it came to trauma, was never linear. One evening, as Keanu sat on the couch reading, he absently flicked on the TV. The sudden burst of sound, an action sequence from an old film, was a mistake. The moment the explosion crackled through the speakers, Ghost panicked. In an instant, he was gone, bolting out of the room so fast that his claws scraped against the hardwood floor. Keanu found him trembling in the hallway, pressed against the wall, eyes wide with raw terror. It wasn't just fear. It was memory. Keanu's chest tightened. He knelt down slowly, careful not to move too close. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe." Ghost was shaking, his breathing ragged. Keanu recognized the signs all too well. He had seen it before in soldiers returning from war, in those who had lived through things no living being should have to endure. What had they done to this dog? The question burned in his mind, but it wasn't until the next day that he got his first answer. Keanu had taken Ghost for a short walk around his property, keeping a respectful distance as the dog moved cautiously through the open space. The fresh air seemed to calm him, his ears twitching at the rustling of leaves rather than shrinking from them. But then the peace shattered. A car turned onto the gravel road leading up to Keanu's house. Not just any car. The black SUV. Keanu's body went rigid, his instincts kicking in before his mind even had time to process. Ghost noticed it too. His entire frame tensed, and before Keanu could react, the dog froze. Not in fear, but in something worse. Submission. The SUV slowed, rolling past as if scoping out the area. Behind the tinted windows, Keanu could make out the faint outline of someone in the driver's seat. Watching, assessing. Then, just as slowly as it had appeared, the vehicle disappeared down the road. Keanu turned back to Ghost, but what he saw sent a chill through him. Ghost was trembling, his entire body locked in place. His ears pinned flat, tail tucked, his breathing shallow. He knew that car. Keanu's jaw tightened. Whoever these people were, they weren't just looking. They were waiting. And if they thought they could come back for this dog, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Keanu had dealt with threats before, stalkers, paparazzi, even the occasional obsessed fan. But this was different. This wasn't just someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for an autograph or a photo. They wanted Ghost, and they weren't going to stop until they got him. That night, Keanu didn't sleep. He stayed by the window, eyes scanning the darkness outside. Ghost lay nearby, curled up on the floor, but his ears twitched at every distant noise. He knew something was wrong. Keanu had to act first. By morning, he had a plan. He called in a favor from an old friend, someone who specialized in finding the kind of people who didn't want to be found. Within hours, he had his answer. The black SUV was registered to a shell company linked to an underground animal fighting ring. The kind of place where dogs weren't pets. They were weapons. Ghost hadn't just been abandoned. He had escaped. Keanu clenched his jaw. He had seen enough violence in his life, enough cruelty disguised as entertainment. And he wasn't about to let Ghost become a victim again. But before he could decide his next move, the choice was made for him. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ghost suddenly tensed. His ears perked, nose twitching as he caught something in the wind. A second later, Keanu heard it too. A car. Approaching fast. He barely had time to react before headlights cut through the trees, blinding white beams piercing the darkness. Then came the sound of tires screeching to a halt. Keanu was already moving, pulling Ghost back into the house as doors slammed shut outside. Then came the voice. Low. Amused. And dangerous. "Mr. Reeves. You have something that belongs to me." Keanu stepped onto the porch, heart pounding but face unreadable. Ghost stayed close, his body coiled tight, ready to bolt or fight. The man standing at the base of the steps looked exactly like the kind of person Keanu had expected. Slick, expensive suit. Too calm. Too confident. The kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted. Behind him, 2 more men loomed near the SUV. Armed. Keanu's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He doesn't belong to anyone. The man smiled. Oh, but he does. See, this dog cost me a lot of money. He was trained for something special. And then he ran. But that's the thing about animals. He took a slow step forward. They always come back to their masters. Keanu didn't move. Didn't blink. But something inside him burned. Ghost was trembling, but not from fear. From memory. This was the man who had hurt him. The man who had turned him into something less than an animal. And now he was here to take him back. Keanu exhaled slowly. His voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the night. Turn around. Leave. Now. The man chuckled, shaking his head. Come on now. Let's not make this messy. A flick of his wrist and one of the men by the SUV reached into his jacket. Ghost growled. A deep, primal sound that sent chills through the air. Keanu stepped forward, placing himself between the dog and the men. His voice dropped, steady as stone. You really don't want to do this. Silence. Tension crackled like electricity. Then, the man smirked. Suit yourself. And everything exploded. A gun was drawn. Keanu moved first. With the reflexes of years spent in action, both in films and real life, he kicked the weapon aside before it could be aimed. A sharp crack of bone followed as he landed a devastating elbow into the attacker's face. Ghost barked, not in fear, but in fury. The second man lunged, but Keanu was faster. A swift maneuver, a precise strike to the ribs, and the attacker crumpled to the ground. The leader, the man in the suit, staggered back, eyes wide. He hadn't expected a fight. Keanu straightened, breathing hard but controlled. His voice was calm, final. Ghost is mine now. For the first time, the man hesitated. He glanced at Ghost, the dog that had once been his, now standing at Keanu's side, no longer afraid. He exhaled sharply, adjusting his cuffs like this was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Then he nodded. You have no idea what you've just done. With that, he turned on his heel, motioning for his men to get up. A moment later, the SUV peeled away into the night, leaving nothing but tire tracks and the distant echo of a threat. Keanu let out a slow breath, his adrenaline finally settling. He turned to Ghost. The dog was staring up at him. Not trembling. Not cowering. But standing tall. Ghost had made his choice. And for the first time, Keanu realized maybe he hadn't just saved this dog. Maybe this dog had saved him too. The night air was heavy with the scent of adrenaline and fading tire smoke. The distant hum of the SUV's engine had long disappeared, but the weight of its presence still lingered. Keanu stood still, his pulse steady but mind racing. He had won tonight's battle, but this wasn't over. Ghost hadn't moved either. He was still standing beside Keanu, watching the road like he expected the enemy to return at any moment. Keanu knelt beside him, his voice low but firm. They're not coming back. Not tonight. Ghost exhaled sharply through his nose. He wasn't trembling anymore. He wasn't shrinking into the shadows. He was here fully present, fully aware, and for the first time, unafraid. That was when it happened. With slow, deliberate movement, Ghost stepped forward and pressed his head against Keanu's chest. Keanu froze. It wasn't forced, wasn't hesitant. It was a choice. Ghost had spent his entire life learning that human hands meant pain. That closeness meant danger. That love was a foreign concept meant for other animals, not him. And yet, here he was. Keanu let out a slow breath and raised a hand, waiting to see if Ghost would pull away. But the dog stayed, his body leaning into the touch as Keanu's fingers brushed gently over his fur. It was the first time anyone had ever touched Ghost without hurting him. For a long moment, they stayed like that, just a man and a dog, 2 survivors who had found each other in the wreckage of their pasts. Then Keanu whispered, "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." And this time, when he turned back toward the house, Ghost followed without hesitation. The days that followed felt different. The house was the same, the routine unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted. Ghost no longer clung to the corners. He still had his moments of hesitation, still twitched at certain noises, still flinched when a shadow passed too quickly. But the difference was he always came back. If he panicked, he found Keanu. If he got overwhelmed, he let himself be comforted. And for the first time, Keanu realized Ghost wasn't the only one healing. For years, Keanu had lived his life on autopilot, moving from set to set, script to script, city to city. He had friends, colleagues, admirers, but he had never really let anyone in. He had learned to exist without attachment, to move through the world without expecting anything permanent. But now there was Ghost. A presence that followed him from room to room, a quiet shadow that was no longer lost but found. One morning, as Keanu was sipping his coffee on the porch, Ghost sat beside him, watching the horizon. Keanu glanced down, studying the dog who had once been too afraid to look him in the eye. "You're not so much of a ghost anymore, are you?" he mused. Ghost's ears twitched, but he didn't turn away. Keanu reached out, scratching gently behind his ears. "You're home now." The words weren't just for Ghost. They were for Keanu too. 6 months later, a new headline swept across social media. Keanu Reeves adopts a rescued dog and fights to shut down an illegal animal fighting ring. The details of the encounter never made it to the press, but the message was clear. The organization behind Ghost's past had been dismantled. Keanu had made sure of that. As for Ghost, he wasn't a lost cause. He wasn't broken. He wasn't just another victim in a cruel world. He was family. And for the first time in his life, Ghost finally knew what it felt like to be safe. Keanu glanced over at him, lying on the floor beside his chair, eyes half-lidded in a rare moment of absolute peace. He reached down, running a hand through Ghost's thick fur. "Not bad for a second chance, huh?" Ghost let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. "Not bad at all. What do you think about this incredible journey of trust, redemption, and second chances? Did Ghost's story move you? Did Keanu's unwavering patience and determination inspire you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story, type 2 in the comments. If you think we could have done better, type 7. We value every opinion. And if you believe in the power of second chances, share the story with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe to Tapestry of Worlds for more stories that stir the soul, challenge the heart, and remind us that kindness can change lives one connection at a time.